It is the 27th of October 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Only 5 days earlier, President Kennedy issued a so-called quarantine on the island nation of Cuba, in an effort to prevent all Soviet military shipping to Castro's regime. While on patrol, American carrier USS Rudolph and 11 other destroyers detect a Soviet Foxtrot-class B-59 submarine near Cuba, which, unbeknownst to the US Navy, was equipped with a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. In an attempt to force the submarine to surface, the US Navy began dropping depth charges around it, and then grenades. With communication with Moscow ceasing for the past few days, and trapped in the sweltering 60 degrees heat in the submarine as the air conditioning was no longer working, the disoriented submarine crew had no idea of what was happening around them, and they feared that World War III had started. With the relentless grenades falling around their submarine, the captain, Valentin Savitsky, and another senior officer decided to launch their nuclear torpedo, with the captain exclaiming, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." Thankfully, that day, Vasili Arkhipov, the chief of staff of the flotilla whose approval was needed for the launch, was present on board the B-59. Ranked equal to the captain, Arkhipov refused to grant firing permission, preferring to wait for Moscow's orders. With this decision, Vasili Arkhipov saved humanity, as, had the nuclear torpedo been launched, the attack could have started a nuclear war which would have caused global devastation. However, this horrifying event was but the tip of the iceberg of the events that happened on the thrilling 27th of October 1962, as preceding this submarine encounter were a horrific series of frightening events that got out of control and threatened to plunge the world into nuclear abyss. This is the historiographer, and in this video, we will explore the hour-by-hour history behind Black Saturday, the 27th of October 1962, also dubbed as the most dangerous day in human history. To understand the events of Black Saturday, we must start with some context. By the 26th of October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which began with American nuclear deployments in Italy and Turkey in 1961, only to be countered by Soviet missile placements in Cuba, had been going on for 11 days.
The United States' answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence, prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. In Cuba itself, 100,000 men were put under emergency orders as they had been during past invasion scares. The waterfront in Havana and along other parts of the coast bristled with gun emplacements as the Cuban regime waited to see what their bosses in the Kremlin were to do. Cuba became the focus of world attention. Here centered the most critical threat of global war since the surrender of Germany 17 years ago. Castro has put every able-bodied man through military training. He has even armed some as young as 12 years of age, and authorities assembled thousands in cities and villages for patriotic rallies. As in the past, these rallies are designed to whip up hate of what Castro calls Yankee imperialistic warmongers. To suggestions that a UN team inspect missile sites, Castro said that they had better come ready for combat. He went on to call President Kennedy a pirate for setting up the quarantine.
EXCOM, also known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, was a group of advisors convened by President Kennedy to discuss and manage the crisis. The council included core members such as Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, as well as non-core members like U.S. Ambassador to the UN Adlai Stevenson and U.S. Presidential Advisor John McCloy, who argued that a peaceful solution, lifting the U.S. quarantine, and an exchange deal with the Soviets was only fair. Stunningly, we have audio records of the EXCOM meetings, which were secretly recorded by JFK.
But I wanted to conclude by making it very clear that the intention here was a standstill, not positive acts. And the standstill was to include the discontinuance of construction, discontinuance of shipping, discontinuance of the quarantine, which we'd have to agree how to do that in 48 hours. After that, we'd
These quote-unquote doves were rebuffed by CIA chief John McCone, who was part of the ex-com hawks favoring tough action.
I don't agree with that, Mr. President. I feel very strongly about it. And I think that the real crux of this matter is the fact that he's got these pointed, for all you know, right now at our hearts. It puts us under a very great handicap to carry out our obligations to not only to our Western European allies, but to the hemisphere. And I think that we've got the momentum now. We've got the feeling that these things are serious and that that threat must be removed before we can drop the quarantine. If we drop that quarantine once, we're never going to be able to put it in effect again. And I feel that we must say that the quarantine goes on until we are satisfied that these are inoperable.
Well, now the quarantine itself won't remove the weapons. So we've only got two ways of removing the weapons. One is to negotiate them out, in other words, trade them out, or the other is to go in and take them out. I don't see any other way you're going to get the weapons out.
By the 26th of October, the US Navy was heavily enforcing the blockade, chasing the Soviet Foxtrot-class subs, who could not surface to recharge their batteries due to the risk of being discovered. Conditions inside these submarines, designed for the Arctic, were horrific in the tropical Caribbean climate. Sea temperatures rose to 80 degrees, while the inside was close to 60. The men, suffering from heavy weather, began fainting from heat strokes. The desperate conditions left most men ill, weak, and unable to sleep in the monstrous heat and suffocating air. It is under these conditions that 2 of the 4 Foxtrot-class submarines were forced to surface and head back to Moscow. Their maskirovka was over. However, 2 other submarines, the B-59 carrying Vasili Arkhipov and the B-36, were still hiding from the Navy's hunting operations. By 6 p.m. Washington time, the State Department begins receiving a message from the US Embassy in Moscow containing a new, private letter from Premier Khrushchev. The letter, composed by Khrushchev himself, is in Robert Kennedy's words, very long and emotional. It contains a proposal for a settlement. I propose we, for our part, will declare that our ships bound for Cuba are not carrying any armaments. You will declare that the United States will not invade Cuba and will not support any other forces which might intend to invade Cuba. Then, the necessity of the presence of our military specialists in Cuba will disappear. On the same day, despite the wishes of his Soviet allies, Fidel Castro orders Cuban anti-aircraft forces to open fire on all US aircraft flying over the island. Unbeknownst to any members of EXCOM, Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin clandestinely met at night in the Soviet embassy, as part of a series of undisclosed discussions during the crisis. Dobrynin cited the US deployment of Jupiter missiles in Turkey to justify the Soviet missile placements in Cuba. Robert Kennedy proposed including the Turkish missiles in a potential resolution. Dobrynin then relayed this message to the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the Soviet ambassador to Cuba, Alexander Alexeyev, was informed by Fidel Castro, whose patience began running thin, that the US attack would be carried out within the next 2 or 3 days. This message was forwarded by Alexeyev to Moscow, heightening the already dangerous tensions. It is on this terrifying note that the day ends, and when the clock arrows ticked for a new day from 11:59 p.m. to 12 a.m., neither President JFK nor Premier Khrushchev knew that the next 24 hours would be the most dangerous in their lives. The 27th of October started off with a bang, or rather, a nuclear bang in the form of a scheduled Soviet nuclear weapons test, with a Soviet bomber dropping a 260 kiloton device at the Arctic archipelago of Novaya Zemlya. Early in the morning, a US U-2 spy airplane commanded by Major Charles Maultsby took off from the Alaskan coast on a reconnaissance operation to look for possible signs of a Soviet nuclear test by collecting air samples. At 9 a.m. in US Eastern Time on the 27th of October 1962, Radio Moscow began broadcasting a message from leader Nikita Khrushchev. In a stark departure from his previous letter on the 26th, the broadcast stated that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey. While Khrushchev's letter the day before had conditioned the withdrawal of Soviet missiles entirely on the US pledge not to invade Cuba, the Soviets had now imposed harsher terms with the inclusion of the removal of US missiles from the two NATO countries. At 10 a.m., ExComm started the first meeting of the day. CIA Director John McCone began the meeting with the usual intelligence briefing, informing the group that 5 SS-4 medium-range nuclear missile sites were operational and another one would be ready within 24 hours. Commander of the US Air Force, Curtis LeMay, also known as Bombs Away LeMay, proposed preemptively striking these sites before completion with a warmongering attitude. McNamara also provided an update on the movements of the Soviet bloc vessels heading towards Cuba. He suggested boarding the Grozny, currently approximately 600 miles away from the quarantine zone around Cuba. This faced opposition from ExComm members, who noted that the Soviets were unaware of the full extent of the quarantine zone. Kennedy agreed to inform the Soviets of the location of the established quarantine line, but as ExComm was discussing this fact, a new letter arrived from Khrushchev. This new letter repeated the radio demand that the United States withdraw its Jupiter missiles to resolve the crisis. Khrushchev wrote, "You are disturbed over Cuba. You say that this disturbs you because it is 90 miles by sea from the coast of the United States, but Turkey joins us. Do you consider then that you have the right to demand security for your own country and the removal of the weapons you call offensive, but do not accord the same right to us? You have placed destructive missiles, which you call offensive, in Turkey, literally next to us. We are willing to remove from Cuba the means which you regard as offensive if your representatives make a declaration that the US will remove its missiles from Turkey. And after that, persons entrusted by the United Nations Security Council could inspect the pledges made." Khrushchev's message highlighted the irony of the entire debacle, as US nuclear missiles were indeed placed in Italy and Turkey in 1961, threatening the Soviet heartland. Unbeknownst to the Soviets, these missiles were considered obsolete, and the US had plans of removing them anyways. However, ExComm agreed that removing them now, under Soviet pressure, would make the US appear weak in front of its NATO allies.
How can we negotiate with somebody who changes the deal before we even get a chance to reply and announces publicly the deal before we receive it?
Thus stood Western pride against Eastern resolve, and it seemed that neither side wished to back down. As this internal debate was happening, at around 11 a.m., Major Charles Maultsby, the pilot of the U-2 spy plane flying a routine mission near Alaska, had apparently become disoriented by the Aurora Borealis and strayed into Soviet airspace by more than 300 miles. The alarmed Soviet High Command, who thought that Washington was sending the spy plane as some sort of reconnaissance in preparation for a nuclear missile launch, had scrambled jets to intercept it. As Major Charles traversed Soviet airspace, the US Air Force deployed F-102 fighters to provide escort without consulting the Pentagon. To add insult to injury, due to the heightened DEFCON 2 status, these fighters were armed with the nuclear-tipped missiles instead of their conventional ones. Air Command had not even informed the Pentagon of this F-102 sortie except 90 minutes later. Secretary of Defense McNamara was informed by Air Command that the U-2 piloted by Major Charles had strayed into Soviet airspace. Upon hearing the news, he turned entirely white and yelled hysterically, "This means war with the Soviet Union." After taking his midday break, John F. Kennedy returned to the Oval Office to receive the news of Major Charles' spy plane that had mistakenly entered Soviet airspace. On the unintended fiasco, JFK famously responded while laughing, "There is always some SOB who doesn't get the word." Fortunately, the U-2 pilot Major Charles successfully landed at an airfield in Alaska. Had there been an engagement between US and Soviet aircraft, the only available weaponry would have been nuclear. At noon, the US test airdropped an 800 kiloton nuclear device at Johnston Island in the Pacific. Thankfully, however, this test, as well as the previous Soviet nuclear test, were routine, as neither White House nor Soviet Presidium records for the day seemed to care. The Soviets were still deploying short-range nuclear-armed cruise missiles to Cuba and had positioned them 15 miles from the US base at Guantanamo. Major Rudolph Anderson was piloting his U-2 on a reconnaissance mission 70,000 miles over Cuba, and his flight path took him right over the nuclear missile sites, raising Soviet fears that he would discover the missile deployments. The decision to fire on Anderson's U-2 was made independently by Soviet generals in Cuba. 2 surface-to-air missiles hit the plane, and shrapnel punctured Anderson's cockpit and pressure suit. His lungs ruptured under the violent decompression of the U-2's cockpit. The remains of his body, strapped to the remnants of his airplane, crashed on Cuban soil. Bad news just kept trickling down, as Kennedy learned of Anderson's death over Cuba at the second ExComm meeting of the day, which began at 4 p.m. Washington time. The tone of the discussion immediately turned dark. The ExComm, when informed of the downing, assumed that the attack had been ordered by the Kremlin and speculated that the move was designed to escalate the crisis. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell D. Taylor recommended that the U.S. Air Force attack the SAM sites the next day, while Secretary McNamara argued that an invasion of Cuba had become inevitable.
The U-2 was shot down. The fire against our low altitude surveillance shut down. Yes, Rod just said it was found shut down.
Yes, this was shot down over Finnish, which is right near a U-2 site in eastern Cuba. The pilot's body is in the plane. Apparently, this was the SAM site that actually had the active fruitcake radar. So it all ties in very closely.
Well, now this is much an escalation by them, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And this relates to the timing. I think we can defer an air attack on Cuba until Wednesday or Thursday, but only if we continue our surveillance and fire against anything that fires against the surveillance aircraft, and only if we maintain a tight blockade in this interim period. If we're willing to do those two things, I think we can defer the air attack until Wednesday or Thursday and take time to go to NATO. And
how do we explain the effect of this Khrushchev message last night with their decision to view their previous orders, the change in orders? We both had flak and a SAM site operator. How do we, that must
how do we interpret this? I don't know how to interpret it.
I feel they must respond now. The whole world knows where we're flying. Yeah, I raised the question we tell each to get the SAM site. We think we have every reason to believe that we know the SAM site. 2 days ago.
How can we send a U-2 fellow over there tomorrow unless we take out all the SAM sites?
Yeah, this is exactly the problem. I don't think we can.
Mandate the pilot?
Yes, sir.
And it's on the ground?
Not on the ground. The record's on the ground. Pilot's in.
From the Soviet side, news of the shootdown were just as nerve-wracking, as Minister of Defense of the USSR, Marshal Malinovsky, mildly reprimanded the officers and ordered that no other U-2s be further attacked. While events on the ground seemed to be spinning out of Washington's control, JFK was struggling with a dilemma: how to respond to the 2 conflicting letters that Khrushchev had sent. As ExComm was scratching its head on how to respond to Khrushchev's letters, an incident that nearly ended the world was happening in the Caribbean Sea. From 4:59 to 5:53 p.m., the destroyer USS Bill and its anti-submarine cohort were dropping depth charges and then hand grenades on a suspected Soviet submarine at the quarantine line. No one aboard the US squadron knew that the submarine was Vasili Arkhipov's B-59 Foxtrot class, armed with a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. Aboard the E-59, the air was thin, tainted with harmful gases like carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and methane. This induced hypoxia, sluggishness, and the disorientation of the crew. Captain Valentin Savitsky's men languished inside the vessel, suffering from painful cramps. After enduring 18 hours submerged in a steel confinement, the ordeal reached a breaking point with the US Navy's barrage of underwater grenades, which were more powerful than the regular depth charges. With just an hour of battery life remaining, the dwindling time for action slipped away, while the lack of oxygen intensified the struggle. Communication with Moscow ceased for the past few days, and trapped inside the sweltering 60 degrees heat in the submarine as the air conditioning was no longer working, the disoriented submarine crew had no idea of what was happening around them, and they feared that World War III had started. They already believed that Moscow was a nuclear wasteland, and that they had to act now. Captain Savitsky lost his composure in the asphyxiating madness, saying, "The war has already started." With the relentless grenades falling around their submarine, Captain Valentin Savitsky and another senior officer decided to launch the nuclear torpedo, with the captain exclaiming, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." Thankfully, that day, Vasili Arkhipov, the chief of staff of the flotilla whose approval was needed for the launch, was present on board the submarine. Vasili had a moment of realization. He understood that there could not be a full-scale war underway. The Americans would not dedicate such significant resources to a diesel submarine if that were the case. They would either destroy the sub or ignore it. Vasili grasped the catastrophic implications of launching a nuclear attack on a US carrier, potentially triggering nuclear chaos. Arkhipov, ranked equal to the captain, refused to grant firing permission. He persuaded Captain Savitsky to authorize a single sonar ping to gauge the Americans' intentions. Sonar readings indicated that the 3 destroyers following them had come to a sudden halt. Upon surfacing, they were greeted by blinding lights from the Navy's vessels. Captain Savitsky issued a stern message to the US Navy's vessels, prompting an apology from the US task group and an end to the confrontation. Had Vasili Arkhipov not intervened, a nuclear catastrophe could have unfolded, potentially leading to devastating consequences. Back in the White House, over the course of the day, ExCom gravitated toward an idea that Attorney General Robert Kennedy had suggested and that came to be known as the Trollope ploy. The United States would formally respond to the first, more conciliatory letter and ignore Khrushchev's second, harsher letter that demanded the removal of US missiles from Italy and Turkey. At 7:40 p.m. on October 27, ExCom got their last intelligence briefing of the day, with devastating news. All of the Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles were now operational. Within 15 minutes of this briefing, JFK instructed his brother to hand-deliver a letter to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, stating that if the Soviet Union agreed to a verified withdrawal of its nuclear missiles and bombers from Cuba, the US would agree to A. remove promptly the quarantine measures, and B. give assurances against an invasion of Cuba. But RFK had more than one letter to deliver. He also had a private message for Khrushchev by Kennedy. The United States was prepared to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months if the Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba, with the US offer being guaranteed by JFK's personal word of honor. After meeting Dobrynin, RFK then returned to the White House for the third and final ExCom meeting of the day. Upon McNamara's advice, JFK agreed that if US reconnaissance planes were fired upon again, the US Air Force would have to return fire. RFK recorded his impression of his brother's mood as Black Saturday came to a close. The president was not optimistic, but what hope there was now rested with Khrushchev revising his course within the next few hours. It was a hope, not an expectation. The expectation was a military confrontation by Tuesday, and possibly tomorrow, Monday, the 28th. Subscribe to join us in the next video, in which we will explore how the entire Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded from Castro's takeover of Cuba to the 1961 Vienna Summit, and finally to the 13 nerve-wracking days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This has been the Historiographer, and for now, see you in the next video.